Namaste and welcome to this Thursday edition of The Right Stand. I am Anand Narasimhan. Jai Hind, ladies and gentlemen. Are there those elements who want to deliberately not just defame India, but create instances of social unrest? And are they deliberately trying to villainize Hindu or those who belong to Hindustan and then mark them with this religious denomination of Hindu and deliberately create a perception that Hindus are violent, Hindus are vitriolic? And this is again stems from this political agenda of taking on Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP. So this Hindutva, dismantling them or trying to demean them, defame them. Is this a larger plot? And was this deliberately done around an India-Pakistan match, using those two matches that happened between the 26th of September and the 3rd of October, and then use those matches to try and incite violence, which unfolded in Leicester and Birmingham, and especially Leicester. And there is a lot that has happened. Now, this evening, here on this edition of The Right Stand, we start with a detailed report that's been put out by the NCRI. We will have the authors and the director NCRI coming up, joining us, and we'll understand from them what is the deep dive that they did. But here is a quick summary of what had happened and what they have found. The summary says that the social media incited hate, platforms, social media, vitriol, posts, misinformation, disinformation were used to try and deliberately fuel the fire or let's say stoke the fire. Malicious online narratives played a very key role. This is the report by the Network Contagion Research Institute or the NCRI. False reports of child kidnapping, dominance, narratives, and also ethnic hatred. All of this was deliberately pushed. They were later on deleted, but they were pushed. On Twitter, Hindus were depicted as the aggressors seeking dominance. Concentrated network in India retweeted hate, fanned violence. Coordinated Hindu-phobic and Islamophobic messaging was done. But more importantly, on the one side, as the Hindus were portrayed as aggressors, the Muslims were being portrayed as victims of this aggression, and therefore the need to fight back and teach the Hindus a lesson. So this was the conversation that was being built, and it manifested. Let's look at some of the tweets or messages that were played out, and they've been quoted in this report by the NCRI. Everyone go down to Leicester right now. It's an obligation to our brothers. We need to put, and then we have to put their Hindu. They even attacked the masjid. So again, rumor mongering that a masjid was attacked. A masjid was never attacked. In fact, the visuals what were caught was that there were people who got on top of a Hindu temple and then brought down the flag. That's what it is. Kidnapped. Children have been kidnapped. There were other kind of rumor mongering, but more importantly, it was also amplified. A lot of misinformation was spread within the UK, and of course, it was amplified by Twitter handles in India. There was this violence engineer, shocking Hindu phobia, the shameful silence of the British media, assault on a Hindu temple and Hindus in Birmingham by Muslim extremists, screams of Allahu Akbar, go drink some cow. I can't say that word on air right now. Go eat some cow. Again, can't say that word on national television. And of course, lots of other abuse that was put out. So this is also something. Now, Birmingham temple burnt by Muslims during Navratri, Hindus beaten up. So there was vitriol which happened the other way around and counter misinformation to further stoke the fire. But 70% of the words that were used and also the involvement of an ISIS and Al-Qaeda sympathizer has all been collated in this report. Again, of the past 20 years, how many UK Hindus have been involved in terrorism? Zero. As far as I know, over the last 20 years, how many UK Muslims have been involved in terrorism? Thousands. Large number of them have fought for the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, #Leicester. So this was also tweeted. So there was information, disinformation, counter-information, and there were this huge amount of engagement that happened on social media. But the larger question that stands at this point is, was this entire violence engineered? Was it done deliberately to stoke passions and to create, orchestrate violence in the street? Because It's the Leicester report that we'll talk about. Let's go across to our panelists this evening. We have the author. Of the report, that is Parth Parihar, joining us. I'm looking forward to also Joel Finkelstein to also join us. Yes, he is the director let me just get that right. Dr. Joel Finkelstein is the director and founder of NCRI. Parth Parihar, author of the NCRI report. Prasiddha Sudhakar is with us, analyst and author of the NCRI. Dr. Vivek Kaul should be joining, is also with us, and Dr. Lavanya Vemsani. So I see 4 panelists. Namaste to everybody. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with Parth because he's one of the authors, and then Dr. Joel, I'll come across to you, sir. Parth, what did you find? What is your biggest take out of this report that you put? Was social media used with a planned motive that these social media will be used to try and fuel the violence on the ground? And did you find a certain organized effort behind this?
Yeah, thanks so much, Anand, for that question and for inviting our whole team to discuss our groundbreaking research here with you today. So I think one of the really big takeaways from our report was that malicious online narratives were key in mobilizing on-the-ground events and violence. And in particular, a lot of events that happened in real life were recast in such a way as to help instigate this violence, to fan the flames. So one example that targeted the British Muslim community was that a temple in Birmingham had been set on fire. And this was clearly intended to stoke passions and violence against that community. But in many cases, and particularly against the Hindu community, these rumors actually led to tangible incidents of violence. So for example, at the very outset, you mentioned these cricket matches that took place during the Asia Cup between India and Pakistan. And there were clashes between the Indian and Pakistani fans outside the stadium. These clashes were recast as being inspired by Hindutva ideology, that they were motivated by Islamophobia, even though there was no evidence to actually suggest that this was the case. And this tone that the violence was being set off by Hindutva ideology, that this was taking over the community, taking over Britain, was something that was deeply penetrative. So later, you mentioned this as well, there was a rumor that was spread that 3 young Hindu men had tried to kidnap a British schoolgirl. And this rumor was used to dox young Hindu teenagers, posting their license plates online, and eventually was also used to mobilize a community basically descending down on Leicester to show the quote-unquote Hindutva thugs who was boss, and really that they couldn't get away with instigating this violence. And this was even though the police had at that point clarified that no such kidnapping had taken place. But the misinformation was so deep and so penetrative that even this clarification by the Leicester police did not have an effect. And in fact, as a result of that mobilization, there were riots between Hindus and Muslims in Leicester on that same day of that mobilization. Finally, as you also mentioned, there were reports of a mosque being attacked, and more specifically, that a Hindu mandir had bussed devotees to attack that mosque. And as a result of that, that Hindu mandir was specifically targeted for a demonstration. It was called the den, the hornet's nest of Nazi Hindutva. And this misinformation was highly penetrative and was also carried by outlets like The Wire and Al Jazeera. So I think what we learned from all of these incidents is how powerful social media can really be in galvanizing on-the-ground events, and how there is a cascade, an informational cascade, that once someone sets a narrative up that this is the cause behind the violence, that this is what's causing it, that becomes very, very hard to reverse.
It also shows a very dangerous trend, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, and it just rings. Prasiddha Sudhakar is also with us. One, that there seem to be entities who seem to have mastered or perfected the art of using social media to create strife, disinformation or misinformation. The other aspect is the othering, which happened with Jews, and then it moved on to with Israel. The kind of language positioning that was being used, that now seems to be appropriated towards Hindus. then the difference between patriot, for us in India, when we say we are nationalist, we are patriot. So an American can stand and say, I am a patriot, and that's fantastic. But if an Indian stands and says, I'm a nationalist, then he becomes Nazi. So you see how they are using the Nazi Hindu narrative. And this whole thing about playing Islam as the victim, because again in the scriptures it says that if you are the victim, then you have the right to fight back. So they create this entire narrative that you're not attacking someone or you're not being the aggressor, you are the victim, so you need to fight back. So that narrative was also visible here.
So I think that the most alarming thing that, in my opinion, comes out of the data that we have is that we're showcasing that ideological actors can use social media as a weapon to harm vulnerable communities. They do that with myths and memes that trust and safety teams aren't familiar with to begin with, right? That most people wouldn't know that drinking cow urine or what have you is a typical attack against Hindus. They would never know that, or the other slurs that we see. So when the heat begins getting ratcheted up, and you have ideological actors that begin using these coded words in order to start planning where and when they will be bussing people in and amplifying the conspiracies to incentivize people to do that. I mean, it's almost like you have a hurricane forming and nobody can even monitor the weather. Okay, so what happens is that these groups then create the facts on the ground. They create how those facts are reported. In some cases, they're actually platformed by major media organizations, right? So we create an entire false narrative around events that are put into play by ideological actors. And we don't have a smoke alarm for that. Okay, so we have to consider that there's every chance that this is going to get worse. I mean, right now, Twitter and other platforms have dramatically cut back on their trust and safety teams, which were completely understaffed and not familiar with much of the cultural fluency and nuance of how people were being harmed here to begin with. So I think we're looking at big risks in the structure of social media, and democracies need to start asking hard questions because these kinds of behaviors are going to be happening not just in places where you have authoritarian regimes and long-standing ethnic conflicts. They're going to start happening in Western democracies. So we need to be serious about detecting these things. We need to be serious about being able to visualize them as they're happening. We need to be serious about having people speak through their differences before this emerges into a full-blown hurricane. So I think these are all things that come out of this report directly.
We'll expand on that, because a lot of these so-called platforms are no longer platforms. They are publishing houses because they have taken sides. They have become opinionated. And they have also developing algorithms which amplify a certain ideology, a certain political narrative, whereas they suppress a different point of view, an alternative point of view. So if the algorithms are being engineered, then the people who are sitting behind coding or people who are in the leadership positions in these organizations are doing it deliberately because they have taken ideological positions. Then they cannot masquerade as platforms. They are then publishing houses. And we've had a case here in India, Prasiddha Sudhakar, as I come to you, that in 2019, there is a case that emerged that Twitter took sponsorship from Khalistani elements for a June referendum agenda that they set. It was actually sponsored and promoted by Twitter. And then 15 days later, they removed the sponsorship and those Twitter handles on those handles magically vanished. But there are screenshots that have been saved, and this is a case in court which showed that Twitter actively was backing those entities who were pushing a secessionist agenda on sovereign Indian soil. They were doing this. So this is already there. And I'm naming it because this matter is in court, this is sub judice. So Prasiddha, did you find that the algorithms were also amplifying this? Were there huge amount of bot activity, and which regions? Because the last time NCRI did a story, we realized a lot of traffic about India was emerging out of Iran, came out from Pakistani elements. This time, what did you find at Leicester?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So I think there's a few points that you touched on. The first is that what we noticed in this is that many of these tweets that called for violence or openly threatened people had been deleted. So when different media outlets or researchers did research about this subject, they weren't able to find a lot of these threatening messages from British Pakistani networks that use cyber swarming. There are open calls to violence that have since been deleted, but thanks to the NCRI's tools and capabilities, we actually have the capability to actually track all of the deleted tweets. So once we captured it, we then took a look at the engagements by day since the initial cricket match and the clashes between Indian and Pakistani cricket fans took place. We saw that these tweets that openly threatened British Indians and British Hindus, saying that you don't want to be messing with Pakistani gangs or Muslims due to the idea of this Hindutva narrative that took place as opposed to general clashes on a cricket match. So that's point number one. And as for bot-like activity, what we found is that during the entire Leicester violence, we examined all of the new accounts that were created.
Right.
So when we looked at those new accounts, we then used open source techniques that look at bot scores that measure whether an account is a bot or not. And when we found several accounts that had very high bot scores, we examined whether their messaging was anti-Hindu or anti-Muslim. So there were several anti-Muslim bots that basically disseminated the same messages over and over again, using these kind of model minority tropes of Hindus, saying, look, Hindus have never been in jail, whereas Muslims have been, and these Muslims are part of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., using anti-Muslim sentiment. But on the other hand, there were also several bots that disseminated anti-Hindu material, basically drawing this binary between good Hindus and these Hindutva extremists that were causing violence and genocide in Leicester, which those claims, obviously, there was no genocide, and these are vastly exaggerated.
So they were very smartly trying to, one, differentiate between good Hindu and bad Hindu, then use one of this group to portray themselves as the violent aggressor Nazi Hindus who are out to get the Muslims. And then once again, overall narrative being that Muslims are the victim. So you need to respond and you need to get aggressive. But there was also a lot of disinformation, misinformation, false information that was given. And what was surprising is, I'll just quickly bring in our other two panelists, Dr. Vivek Kaul and Lavanya ji. Dr. Kaul, one of the aspects is that the person who was at the chair to probe this, ironically, the authorities decided on Dr. Chris Allen. He had to step down later, but his position clearly was that he was going to bat for only one side. He was never a neutral. So how was the system also sold to this narrative? And why didn't the system pick up this kind of an activity on social media and say, all right, let's put a lid on it before, it just blows into a full-blown hurricane, or what it turned out to be eventually in Leicester?
Rahul, to have
this is Anand Narasimhan here. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Mindset. Anand. Sorry, Anand. So, one has to understand, it is a huge organization which does all these things against Hindus or things. You would have realized in 2019, after the Article 370 was abrogated, there was a huge violence against Indians, around the High Commission of India. So the whole thing is orchestrated not by these jihadis whom we are blaming, but by Pakistani embassy. They have huge anti-India cells. So they have this ISI network. I know few Pakistanis who get telephone calls that you have to be at a particular place, come what may. It's orchestrated by Hindus, and Indians only have one enemy. It is ISI and Pakistan. It is all orchestrated by them, whether it be Geneva, America, London, Leicester, Birmingham, Manchester, is all done by them. And these are all jihadis are on their payroll. That is how they are done. And the same way, as you said, the Professor Allen, he is an Islamophobic professor. His chair has been donated by these jihadis or whatever you call them. So his choice of being an investigator was flawed, because we knew that he would give a report blaming these so-called terrorist Hindus, Hindutva Hindus and all that nonsense. So we raised a lot of points in the social media, and he had to resign. I mean, that's how it is. There is a narrative built by a big organization which is anti-Hindu, anti-India, as I told you, and this cascades down through masjids, through people, through jihadis. They are the masterminds.
No, but how are these big media organizations out of, and you protested outside that organization? That is a state-funded organization, sir. Its international wing has got huge amounts of money that is approved under the MEA budgets. So how is it that a state-funded organization's wing, that wing has got a position which it takes? And if that is manifesting on social media, Lavanyaji, how are we going to counter this? NCRI will do a deep dive which will be on hindsight, post facto. But on that note, at that point, Leicester was on the boil. People, innocents, were fearing for their lives, and a lot of them got caught in the crossfire. How many Hindus had to see their temple being desecrated by elements who thought that Hindus are bad people?
Yes, that is what is actually in the making for almost a decade. I have warned about this a number of times on your discussion with you, Anand, as well as on congressional briefing, and one of my recent papers published about Hinduphobia in Journal of Review of Sociology also discusses this. There are two sides to this issue. The first side is that there is a pattern of riling up sentiments and violence, notable in the sections of major media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc. And this is not limited to just social media, but media and other sections also. So there is this immediate action that is being perpetrated. The second side is that there is a long narrative that has been constructed in the media and academia and certain politicians, popularizing and normalizing this word Hindu extremists. And they also popularized this Hindu versus Hindutva, dividing, the practicing Hindus. What happens because of this type of normalization of terms like Hindutva and Hindu extremists, Hindu Nazis and all this, is that simple practicing Hindus are targeted and isolated. This actually has been seen on a smaller scale in the US. The celebration against Hindutva and, Hindus against Holi. This type of activities may seem mild, but these are actually being constructed. These are actually perpetrating a narrative that is being built. This actually isolates Hindus, isolates their practices, isolates their activities, normal day-to-day activities like celebrating their festivals or acting on their normal behavior to be seen as something bad. And that also allows these others to implicate them and attack them easily. And that is what is done in the media in the recent years. And of course, our academia has done it already by popularizing this Hindu versus Hindutva.
Correct.
So if we are to counter this, the first thing is the law and order should not be sleeping on the issue. They should have a cyber security monitoring cell and actively involved and be proactive in monitoring this type of activities anytime they see a smaller disturbance. And the second thing is the media and the academia, the narratives that are being built should be countered. The narrative has continued for a long time without being countered. The problem because of this is that, Hindus, general simple Hindus are being targeted. Simple Hindu practices are being targeted because being Hindu is seen as Hindutva. Which is a problem. And this is using the Gomulsian technique.
Not just that, this is exactly what was done with the Jews. This is exactly the othering was done with Israel. And this is exactly what they are doing. There is a replication. If you see Chris Allen's piece, in 2001, white Christian supremacists have been replaced by Hindutva forces. And blacks have been replaced with Muslims. So that's how, and at that time, 2001, again, Muslims were becoming vulnerable despite 2000, the 9/11 happened, and after that he wrote that paper, I remember clearly. And so those parallels are being done. On the other hand, this Brahminism versus Afro-Dalits. So blacks are being replaced by Dalits, and white supremacists are being replaced by this entire Brahminism concept. This is also mentioned by by Rajiv Malhotra in Snakes in the Ganga. And this is all happening academia. But social media, Dr. Joel Finkelson, I'm coming back to, on social media, when I use certain phrases, I get flagged. You are using sensitive content. But There are other content which is also sensitive that doesn't get flagged, that actually gets amplified. So we got somebody is doing this deliberately.
Yeah. Look, I think you're making really crucial points, Anand, and I think that there's a lot of sanity to what you're both describing in terms of the significant challenges that we have making sense of how to detect and report on threats that are emerging from social media, right? Because how we report on those and who is reporting on them ends up playing into things that impact everyone's safety. And the people reporting on them are essentially getting to play referee, right? So we have to remember that, when we talk about governments taking a stand to sort of police disinformation, we end up with George Orwell. We end up with the truth ministries, right? So there's a huge challenge in being able to find trusted sources that can reliably report on what is and is not disinformation without themselves having very specific biases. So I think that the narratives that we're concerned about in terms of who takes the ball and runs up the court with it politically, right? We can invert those, and we see some of those problems with that in the paper we're describing here. As the attacks happened in Leicester, you had a huge bloom of inauthentic activity in India that was generating robust amounts of outrage, so much of that justifiable, but a lot of it contained genocidal ideology as well. And we had that problem, coming up not just in England, but we had reactionary gas kind of outpouring and heating up in the subcontinent as well. And what happens is that both sides are capable of using social media in order to gin up support for increasingly extreme positions. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, who do we trust to describe that reality? Who do we trust to be able to wear the stripes and point out when my side is doing it and when your side is doing it? And how do we make that person credible so they don't get tackled in the field while people are trying to play with the ball? Right?
Exactly.
These are questions that democracies haven't answered successfully. And they're stopping us from being able to have smoke detectors to be able to detect threats, because what is and isn't a threat is all about people's political positions. So we've got to find a way to solve these very challenging problems. We're showcasing that we have the technology to do that. The technology isn't actually the problem. The problem is creating consensus and being able to identify things and alarm people in ways that aren't politically biased and that are reliable, that are benevolent, and that are capable. We have not yet developed a broadcasting mechanism that is treated that way or acts that way.
No, I agree there. But this is what happens. Democracies don't have rules, and this is now beyond borders. So what happens, or what is applicable on British soil may not be applicable on Indian soil. And these so-called platforms, I refuse to call them platforms because they are now publishing houses, because they are allowing certain people to publish and not allowing others to publish. They amplify and increase the followers of certain people, and the others remain stable. And I'm saying it by experience, and I can see it on a day-to-day basis. On one of the platforms, my number of followers has remained the same for the last 4 months. It just remained the same. It goes up by 20, comes down by 15, goes up by 3, comes down by 7, but it remains in that same barometer. Now, that's not possible unless it's being engineered. Unless there is an algorithm which says entities like this, it's been coded to say, all right, mark them, park them. Then you're not a platform. Then you are a publishing house which is deciding and which is decided to take sides. And Parth, in this case, there are people who have figured out how to use these kind of social media publishing houses or platforms to their advantage. You see the previous report, I remember, there also you said all these accounts suddenly changed their name, origin, profile, etc. to look a certain way, and then these handles went away and new ones were created. So every time they want to create a spurt on an activity, new entities or new accounts will come and they'll start pushing similar content. It's a cut, copy, paste job, saying, okay, this group will push this group will push this, but overall we have to create an impression that this is happening. Parth.
That's a really good point that you make, Anand. I want to echo what Joel was saying, which is that this is both a very dangerous problem that we're seeing, this amplification and contagion on social networks, as you call them, publishing houses. but it's also something that is a very difficult problem to regulate. And in particular, states and state actors are very, very bad at dealing with this problem, precisely because of the amount of political incentives that are involved. It's very difficult to identify what speech ex ante will be incendiary. And this is exactly where the expertise of a nonpartisan body like the NCRI, which has the research capability and the on-the-ground experience in dealing with these types of incidents from the past, is indispensable in advising all sorts of actors, social media companies, governments, etc. Now, to your point about actors using these platforms to their benefit, I think that that's definitely true. One of the mechanisms that we saw used on social media to mobilize violence in this particular instance was also social media polls.
Right.
So one poll that we saw on Instagram actually asked people, after providing them with a long list of leading prompts, whether they should go to Leicester to avenge that kidnapping, which, as we've established, never happened. Right. So now we're seeing that these tools that are on social media that are meant to draw engagement, to bring people together, right, are being used to help mobilize people in doing these actions.
Right.
So I think that it's important for us to identify all of these things. And just one final point before I hand it back to you. In many cases, we've seen that memes that I think are, unarguably hate speech. Right. So from our last report, we had a Hindu man being gassed by Pepe the Frog, who was dressed as a Nazi. Right.
Correct.
These things, a Hindu person being beheaded as a meme, these things are things that clearly fall under the line of hate speech, and yet we see that they persist on platforms like Twitter.
Yeah.
Similarly, in our last paper, we saw that there was little to no recognition of the word Bajit as an anti-Hindu slur prior to that publication coming out. Again, in this case, we see that there was a huge surge in the use of slurs like cow piss drinker prior to these same slurs being used at a mandir in Birmingham, where a mob was literally chanting these slurs at the devotees there.
Right.
So we see that there's consistently examples of very clear violations of hate speech that aren't being recognized as such, and it's because that awareness doesn't exist, and that awareness can only arise from nonpartisan bodies like the NCRI and many others that are doing great work in this area.
Right. Congratulations, and thank you for putting the facts out there and at least keeping people aware. And we are using the same publishing houses and platforms to also put this out. So to their credit, they have not blocked that. And let's hope that doesn't come to pass in a day where they say, oh, any of this kind of corrective information or putting out the facts will also be blocked, because somewhere there seems to be some algorithms which need to be corrected and get their coding right. But we also need to get our code in terms of the laws right as to how do we stop such activities. There needs to be a rethink even in Britain, because Britain allowed a lot to, the British authorities allowed a lot to happen on social media before taking action. To all our panelists, I have to say thank you and quickly move on, because we've had a very big development closer home. Thank you very much. And it's news just coming through where the centre has now filed a review petition in the Honourable Supreme Court against the November 11 order allowing the release of all the convicts in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case. So Peralivalan had come out sometime last year, but this was freeing the others. And Congress had raised an exception with Abhishek Manu Singhvi addressing a press conference. The Gandhi family has come on record saying they forgive the assassin. But overall, the question was this setting a dangerous precedent? Let's go across to Maria Shakil joining us with more details. What's the ground for the centre filing a review petition?
Yes, so the centre is saying that they weren't really heard on the matter by the Supreme Court. Remember, Anand, that in 2018, the centre's submission was very clear that the assassination was the most heinous and brutal crime, and that it was an attack on the country because it is the assassination of a former Prime Minister of India that we are looking at. And the centre's petition in 2018 had said very clearly that the assassination was an unparalleled act in the annals of crimes committed in the country and will set a dangerous precedent and lead to international ramifications by other such criminals in the future. So that is what the nature of petition in 2018 was. And that is the reason why the center has now filed a review petition saying clearly that they weren't really heard by the Supreme Court on this matter, and hence they would like to express their views.
Well, thank you for your inputs, Maria. Moving on to set up another important conversation that needs to be had, and India is championing this. There is a conversation on no money for terror. And this will be inaugurated, this two-day engagement will be inaugurated by the Prime Minister himself on Friday. And the closing comments were given to understand it will run late into Saturday, will be by the Union Home Minister, Shri Amit Shah. But in this case, the question and perhaps the aspect that needs to be discussed is all terror across the world happens because there is money that's getting to them. Someone is sending money, using certain devious means, subverting the system, hoodwinking the system somehow or the other. If this money flow is stopped, if the economics of terror is cracked down upon, terrorism itself will perhaps be brought to a naught. So the terror financing spectre, and let's look at the challenges. One of the aspects is that it's anonymous, it's decentralized and often untraceable. That's how the funding happens. The second challenge is that there is no universal consensus on cybercrime laws. The other aspect is that there are nations which want to brand good terrorists and bad terrorists. So we have a problem there too. There is weak monitoring and control mechanisms on social media platforms. A lot of social media platforms / publishing houses now are being used for crowdfunding. No effective legislative framework against illicit funding. Need for effective multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach. All of these aspects are important. Now, what are the modern maneuvers? Fundings are disguised as legitimate financing and commerce. So it's either trade or they use charity. The fronts are always charitable institutions or trading entities. There is also improvisation that happens, customization of tech which is happening. Cryptocurrency is a big challenge because you just don't know who the end receiver is. So send the money, sign out, log out, set up a platform, transfer money, sign out, finish. No trace at all. Crowdfunding, distortions, illicit internet fund transfers, all of these aspects remain huge challenges. Is it perhaps the biggest challenge in our fight against terrorism? The financing aspect. Let's go across to gentlemen who have not just dealt with multiple range of issues throughout their glowing careers, but they have also tried to find solutions or negate this challenge. Lieutenant General K.J. Singh, B.V. Kumarji and Sushant Sareen. Namaste. Thank you very, very much.
No, thank you, Anand.
I'm going to start with B.V. Kumarji and ask you, B.V. Kumarji, narcotics is one of the biggest routes. Narco-terror has been a huge challenge, along with laundering. Is there a way to crack this? And now it's also entering into this entire cyber domain. Yes, B.V. Kumarji.
Yeah. Anand, you mentioned that there is no international coordinated action. To a certain extent, that's not exactly correct. There's an international convention for the suppression of financing terrorism, and India is a signatory to that convention. That apart, as you rightly said, drugs is one of the major sources for financing terrorism. Can I continue, Anand?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the amount of money that's generated in drug trafficking is almost $500 billion. So a part of it is definitely going for the financing of terrorism. Pakistan, in our immediate neighborhood, is one of the most important players in this particular aspect, and their national policy itself is involved in this kind of thing. It follows a policy which is most brutal form due to its far-reaching and long consequences, but it's rapidly intensifying. Further, it is increasingly getting clear that narco-terrorism in the Pakistan context blurs the line between drug trafficking and criminal networks and terrorist organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Haqqani network, closely working with ISI and Pakistani army. Apart from drugs, Pakistan is also involved in smuggling fake currency into India to destabilize our economic structure. That's another important thing. They've also established contacts with our northeast terrorist outfits like NSCN, IM and ULFA. The aim of the proxy war waged by Pakistan within India is to extend the Indian state, its administration and security forces and create instability. This apart, there are other sources also from which funds are generated for financing terrorism. See, in our immediate neighborhood, if you kindly see, in Bangladesh, there are a couple of organizations like the Global Relief Foundation set up for religious and scientific education and for scientific purposes. It had direct ties with Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Right now, the organization is defunct, but another organization, Al-Harmain Islamic Foundation, an NGO located in Riyadh, has links with Al-Qaeda and encourages donations on its websites. Using internet increasingly to finance terrorism, and particularly online gambling is one of the main sources from which funds are generated. Hamas has been accused for importing fake currency from Iran for financing terrorism in other areas and things like that. Like that, the number of sources are being used, including, for example, funds generated in smuggling, in diamond export and import business and other things, where a lot of funds are generated, and through Hawala network, they are converted into legal sources, which are ultimately reaches the terrorist outfit. And not only that, the terrorist outfits have a big network where they have to fund themselves to recruit terrorists, logistics, indoctrination, training, arms and ammunition procurement, explosives, propaganda and psychological war activities, and most important, for actual financing of specific terrorist activities. So there is various types of strategies are being adopted by terrorist organizations to find sources from which funds can be generated for their nefarious activities.
And they always say that the crooks always think more, and they are always 2 steps ahead of the cops or those who want to catch them. So General KJ Singh, how do we do this? 75 nations are going to participate. Pakistan is going to skip. India has very clearly said we have not invited them, but they've invited the Chinese here. All these nations, or a lot of these nations or entities, have their own perception of who's a terrorist and who's not. What should be funded and what should be not. So how do we get consensus? And how do we crack this?
Anand, thank you for having me on your show. The problem is that there are newer forms and newer challenges which are coming up. Like drones have become a big challenge now. It's very easy to ferry a consignment of drugs, some weapons, even currency, and dump it on this site to give it to the people who are organizing and orchestrating these events. If we remember, in Jammu and Kashmir, there was this stone pelting which used to go on.
Yeah.
And these chaps used to call themselves as Sangbas. Now, how were these chaps operating? They were all being given certain amounts of money, and certain amount of a drug or a recreational stuff is also given to some of them to denumb, sort of to get them into a state of agitation to do these things. I saw it in Nagaland also. But Anand, what I want to flag is, it's not only these groups, it is the people who organize these activities, like big dry fruit merchants in Valley and all these people. They do under invoicing. There's some sort of commodity exchange which takes place. So we have to constantly remain on vigil. And you have rightly flagged this issue. Traditionally, the Western nations have been classifying terrorism as good terrorism and bad terrorism. What does not affect them, they just tolerate that. But that's not going to work, because once you allow this, then they don't spare anybody. And there are organizations like in Pakistan, like Falah Insaniyat, Jamaat Dawa, on the name of charity and all this. They collect funds, they do recruitment,
Ji.
They send people across. So Anand, it's a big challenge. And good thing is India has taken a leadership role in this. We are hosting this conference. We are providing platform. And India has a good amount of competence in fintech, on financial technology. So all this can be leveraged. And there are no simple solutions. There are no, like you say, that they always outthink. They always do something.
Correct, but we've got to make it difficult,
So
and
have
we've got to try and push them to think harder, General Saab. That's what we have to do. But Sushant Sareen, when America evacuated Afghanistan, they left behind nearly 80 billion worth of arms and ammunition. Where did that go? And if it has gone into the laps of terrorists, then who's funding terror and who's not? So how do you answer these questions? And who do you hold accountable?
Anand, I'm a little skeptical about the 80 billion figure, but I think you're right. The larger point you make is absolutely on the money. That a substantial number of weapons were left behind, especially the weapons, the small weapons, the weapons of terrorists. And I think that is a matter of greater concern than, maybe some helicopter gunships or tanks. The terrorists are not going to drive tanks into, and do terrorism. It's the small weapons and the force multipliers which actually exacerbate the problem.
Yeah.
But I think both my colleagues have been absolutely right when they say that, look, this is a constant catch-up game, right? The guys who are going to be indulging in terror finance, the guys who are going to be indulging in money laundering, and there is a solid nexus between the two. They are going to look at whatever loopholes they can find, and they are going to exploit those. So, for example, if you say that, okay, not more than $10,000 can be carried or can be transferred in one go, they will transfer 9,990. Okay, it doesn't come under the radar screen, and you can do multiple transactions of that nature. I think what is required to be done, number one, at the governmental and at the financial institution level, because much of this money laundering has to come back into the legal system to actually become effective, right? And the only way you can actually start monitoring this is through big data analytics. I think some efforts have been made in that direction, but a lot more needs to be done. Second, you have to be, constantly looking out for the new stuff which is happening. So, for example, now we have heard in Punjab that many of the gangsters who are also now doubling up as terrorists and have been carrying out hits on behalf of the Pakistanis and other characters have been involved in crime, have been involved in drug smuggling, but have been involved in sponsoring singers, right? A lot of the Punjabi pop music scene and stars are being funded, are being threatened, are being intimidated by these gangs. And then whatever earnings they are making, those are funneled back to these gangs, or their earnings go into making albums and then they are funneled back to them. So that is a new thing which we have discovered. You must have recently read about how this app called Tinder is being used to do money laundering and terror financing.
Yes.
But most importantly, Anand, I think it was Mr. Kumar who was talking about international conventions and all of that. Look, all these conventions will only stand if the states which are signatory to these conventions actually follow these conventions. But let's look at Pakistan, for example. Just 2 days back, a big scandal, although that scandal is old, but some new information has come out, that the Prime Minister of the country indulges in money laundering by sending his girlfriend or his wife's girlfriend or whatever to Dubai to sell a very expensive watch. And then the lady comes back in a private aircraft with about $2 million in cash. Now, and this, when the same Imran Khan government went to FATF and, the Pakistanis have been saying that, look, we have really cleaned up our entire system. There is no more money laundering.
Right.
We have clamped down on terror financing. We've clamped down on money laundering. Not a damn thing can move without the regulatory and the supervisory frameworks coming into action. And yet, when you have the Prime Minister of the country indulging in this activity, which is clear money laundering, then what do you say? And it's not only the Prime Minister. You have the ISI and other these characters who also used similar sources and similar people to launder the money.
Correct.
So the problem is both what countries have to do within to beef up their systems through, for example, big data analytics, and what the international community has to do to clamp down on countries like Pakistan, which indulge in this kind of activity with gay abandon.
Right, because in our region we look at Pakistan, but it extends. It extends to the Houthis. It also extends to what is happening in certain other pockets of Africa. Who's backing the Boko Haram? How are they making their money in South America? It's a global phenomenon. Even on the eastern side, there are so many such entities who are being backed by different levels. But we have to collectively decide that we need to put a lid to it. Can India lead that thought? We have to wait and watch. I thank all our panelists. Thank you very much. I'm way over time. Quickly taking a break. When we come back, it's a mega CNN News 18 exclusive on who is actually orchestrating this entire psyops of threatening honest, upright journalists who stand steadfast with the idea of India. Stay with us.
Weapons with a veto in the Security Council spanning 9 time zones run by one person. So we can't be sure. I think that my gut is that he will survive because he has created what he himself calls a vertical of power, which is so strong that it's very difficult to imagine even a military defeat dislodging him. Because who would replace him? Would it be a general? Would it be he's insulated himself from a lot of challenges. He's killed most of his political opponents or jailed them or exiled them. The military is, as far as we can tell, firmly under his control. He has a presidential guard, by the way, that is the only army that is allowed in Moscow. We're not sure how large it is, but it is probably over 100,000 soldiers that are under his personal control. It's a kind of like the Roman emperors had this Praetorian Guard. Putin has his own Praetorian Guard. It's a significant blow, but I myself think it would take more than that to dislodge this guy who's been in power 21 years now.
We have information from the Polish president. Also, American officials have been saying this over the last few hours, that it looks likely that this missile originated from Ukraine and not from Russia, and that it accidentally strayed onto Polish territory, killing 2 Polish citizens. Does this now sort of dampen down, scale down the possibility of any escalation in this war?
Oh, yes. I think it's highly unlikely that this event will produce any kind of upward spiral or escalatory spiral. Frankly, even if it had come out of Russian territory, I think it has been heartening to see the seriousness, the sobriety, and the caution with which mostly all the NATO members have been handling this. Recognizing that the important issue is not even was there something that came out of Russia, but was there an intention? Does it appear to have been a planned attack? I think people recognize that, look, war is a very messy business, and this is one of the many reasons why wars are terrible, and the sooner we can end this war, the better. There are going to be these kind of accidents, miscalculations, things like that. The important thing is to keep guardrails in place that do not produce unnecessary escalation, particularly escalation that comes out of an accident. So I think it's been heartening to see that there has been no irresponsible behavior on any side with regard to this. So I think that the chances of escalation are pretty low.
Had this been actually a missile that was fired from Russia with intent or accidentally and then hit Polish territory, do you think NATO would have been forced to respond because of Article 5, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all?
No, I think that, look, the Russians, if you remember, shot down a Malaysian airliner, and it didn't produce any kind of, any calls for an attack on Russia. Look, there is a very important difference between an intentional launch and an accidental, not even a launch, but the straying of a missile, which appears to be exactly what happened here. I think that Poland might have called a meeting to convey the importance and the seriousness of this, partly because obviously when you lose your own people, you have to show that you care about it and you want to do something. But I don't think we're not in a world in which that an accidental launch would result in NATO declaring war on Russia.
It's going to be 9 months since this war began next week. What is your assessment of where things stand as of right now? Two questions that people are asking: one, who's winning this war, and two, when is it going to end?
Russia is without any question losing the war, by which I mean, if you ask yourself, what were Russia's objectives? Russia's objectives were to take Kyiv, to topple the Ukrainian government, to instill fear in all those Ukrainians who have supported this Ukrainian democratic government. All those objectives have not been met. And in fact, the Russian army has moved out of about 50 to 60% of the territory that they gained since February 24th. In other words, they've been pushed back, not quite to their February 24th positions, but to very close to those positions. They've also lost, as far as one can tell, almost half of their advanced armored equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, missiles, things like that. And
back on the right stand, and it's time for the real report. On this real report, we get you exclusive details from intelligence sources on the selective targeting of journalists and media persons in Jammu and Kashmir, especially in the Kashmir Valley. On Wednesday, we told you how deep the deep state in Pakistan has tasked terrorists with threatening and blackmailing journalists, demanding that they continue to portray India as a war zone and not report on the Vikas drive in the Union Territory after the abrogation of Article 370. It is a desperate propaganda campaign to maintain the environment of fear and despair in the Kashmir Valley. As per sources, this campaign is being led by the Lashkar operatives in the valley, who have been given a list of journalists to harass and threaten. Now CNN News 18 has accessed the dossier, which exposes the mastermind of this conspiracy. Intelligence agencies have had their lens on this man named Mukhtar Baba, a native of Srinagar who years ago escaped to Ankara in Turkey. He has close ties with the Pakistan establishment and has emerged as a kingpin and expert in using social media, in building and propagating false narratives, as well as grooming youngsters for terror in the valley under the banner of the Lashkar Front, TRF. As per intelligence sources, he has built a network of informers and among journalists and is notorious for forcing journalists in Kashmir to toe the Pakistani line. He's been doing it for more than a decade and a half, and now he continues to remain in touch with such elements. In fact, intelligence sources say he was placed in Turkey around 2018 by a former ISI agent, an American national of German origin named Joda Karen Fisher. Mukhtar Baba has prepared a hit list to tackle those journalists who promote Badlav and Vikas in the Kashmir Valley, namely crackdown on terror. Intelligence agency says he was linked to the terror outfit the Hezbollah in the 90s and was shunted out for selling weapons to another terror group, nearly 40 AK-47 rifles. He has also been linked to separatist leader Masarat Alam and played a major role in the 2010 summer agitation. Mukhtar Baba has worked with Kashmiri media elements like Great Kashmir, the Kashmir Observer, CNS and PVI, and thus familiar with the media environment in the valley. He has spearheaded multiple campaigns to conflate terror threats with action of the security agencies in the valley. Sources also say he's in touch with the ISI operative Sajjad Gul, where chat intercepts show direct and regular contact with the communications chief of the TRF. Sources say Sajjad Gul is trained in Adobe and Photoshop and spearheads the social media campaigns, namely the calls to action, anti-India propaganda, as well as threat messages. Sajjad Gul operates from Pakistan, and intel sources say that the two had also discussed the murder of Shujat Bukhari in the past. So we see a concerted campaign of information warfare emanating from Pakistan with links to Turkey targeting the people of Kashmir to derail the post-370 agenda. Intelligence agencies say 6 individuals are in frequent contact with Mukhtar Baba, and the agencies are planning a major crackdown on such psyops. 2 of these individuals have been located and identified, and the suggestion is pick them up, targeting their networks within India as well as sources of funding and assets. Now, beyond the guns and bombs, the information war continues to rage over in Kashmir. While Indian forces are dismantling the terror infrastructure in the valley, we cannot lose sight of the aspect of crushing the conflict. Crushing this is essential to win the critical battle of hearts and minds in Kashmir.
Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zakir Jacob. There is fresh drama around the Shraddha Walkar murder case. Her murderer boyfriend Aftab was produced in court today virtually. In fact, the police told the court it was too dangerous to produce him physically. Therefore, it was a virtual hearing. The court then sent him to a further 5 days in police custody. The court is